Hey, it's Jared with Gear and Light. Today we're going to be comparing the Panasonic Lumix GH6 and the Sony a7 IV. These are two cameras that I'm excited about and have really enjoyed using. Sony because the Sony a7 IV is just the natural progression of cameras for me, as I've been a Sony shooter since the a7S first came out over 10 years ago, I'm sure it is now. I switched over from Canon originally, but the GH6 and previous versions is something that I always see a lot of video shooters using, and I've seen it on professional sets as B cams, and the GH6 is just a progression of a camera that many video shooters really like. It's had a great price point, it has good features, and I finally decided it's time to do a test and compare, because I want to be using the best cameras for the money, and of course that's my return on investment for the business that I run, shooting video, also producing YouTube videos, and so it's important for me to try different cameras. So we're going to start by talking about the GH6. I have it right here in front of me, and I'm filming on the a7 IV. So what I'm looking into right now is an a7 IV. You're going to see it later in this video because I'm going to swap cameras, and when I start talking about the a7 IV, we'll be filming with the GH6, which I think will give us a good comparison here. And then I'll talk about my experiences with both of these cameras as I've been comparing them out in the field and trying them as photo cameras, as video cameras, and just my overall experiences there. So let's talk about the GH6. First of all, it's budget friendly for its features. It's not really that much cheaper than the a7 IV, but it is budget friendly for a camera that can shoot 5.7K at 60p, 422 10-bit, and also shoots ProRes internal. Those are the crazy features that really make this camera stand out, and those features usually are found on cameras twice the price or so of this camera. So if ProRes is your workflow and you want to shoot internally, this camera is a great option. However, it's very easy to get ProRes out of any camera using an Atomos monitor recorder, and that's what I use so that I can get ProRes right into my computer. So another thing that I thought was cool, and I've been talking about this for a long time because those of you that have been around on this channel know that I'm not a fan of the flip-out screen. I think the flip-out screen is something that's just always in the way for me. I think that it has its place, especially in situations where I'm looking at the camera here and I want to see and make sure that I'm recording and see what's on the screen. But in most instances where I'm shooting handheld or even on a tripod, I don't want the screen out to the side of the camera. I want to look straight down the camera, and I want to see what I see straight down the camera. So with this flip out screen, what they did was they also made it a tilt screen, and so it tilts up. It doesn't tilt up a lot, but it does tilt up a bit here, and that is a really neat feature. I've made comments about, like, we should have the technology to be able to do both, and Panasonic went ahead and did both with this camera. Now it does make the tilt-up screen quite a bit thicker because there's a lot going on here with the tilt-up and the rotation, but nonetheless, they achieved it, and kudos to them for pulling that off. Now you'll also see that we've got some venting here on the camera. I'm going to walk around this camera here in a second, but as far as features go, this camera, yes, it has a lot of built-in video features. It does not have a whole lot of good photo features. It sacrifices big time there, and it's also a micro four thirds sensor. Now, this lens that I'm using on this camera is the Lumix 25-50. This lens is really nice. I was super excited to get to use it because it is a Leica lens and just a beautiful lens. Very nice, built really well, feels really sturdy. And I've really enjoyed taking pictures and shooting video clips with this lens attached to this camera. So let's walk around the camera. I've got the Rode mic on it because I was shooting some stuff and wanted a little bit of audio. I'm going to go ahead and pull the Rode Video Mic Go 2 off right now, and we're just going to walk around the camera. So this is a bit of a chunky camera. Being that it's a micro four thirds sensor, a very small sensor, you'd think small camera body. But I understand that as a video shooter, we need a little bit more to hold on to and bigger buttons and knobs because we're making lots of changes all the time. And so having a smaller camera for the sake of having a smaller camera, I mean, Sony has learned that lesson. The A7S, their first video-centric mirrorless camera, has grown by leaps and bounds since it first came out. So a bigger camera body I'm not afraid of. It is a little bit heavy though, especially with this lens. This does weigh a bit. I don't have a scale with me, but it is pretty heavy. I would say it probably weighs about what my A7 IV would weigh with a 70 to 200 lens. This is pretty heavy. So on the top of the camera, we've got our mode dials here. We've got our power switch. We've got some quick buttons that take us to white balance, ISO, and our exposure compensation. We've got the shutter. I can adjust my aperture here, my shutter speed here, and then with the press of a button, I could pretty much use any of these knobs to adjust the ISO. Record button is right here. However, like when I'm holding this camera and I want to hit record, and I may be holding it one-handed, like I have to do that with my thumb, and it's kind of a weird position, and it just doesn't feel natural. I can't get my index finger all the way back there to get to the record button. Granted, there is an additional record button down here, and so if I'm holding the camera, I can easily just hit the record button with my thumb down here or my fingertip and hit record. But I think the placement of the record button is kind of weird. They could have replaced it with this button and just maybe switch these two buttons, and it would have been a little bit easier to reach as far as a record button. But I recognize that this camera is not necessarily something that people are using handheld. Even though it does have amazing in-body stabilization, the GH6 improves even more so over previous models with the in-body stabilization. And if you combine that with lenses that have stabilization as well, then it's just, you're going to get extremely stable footage out of this camera. Then we have over here on the right side the SD and CF Express card slot. You get one of each, and so you can use an SD card, and you can also use a CF Express Type B card. But you can't use two SD cards. You can only use one of each, and that's kind of a bummer. I do like to shoot to two cards, and I do recognize that the CF Express is typically a little bit faster than even a V90 SD card, but I prefer to use V90 SD cards, but I don't know. On the Sony camera, I can also use the CF Express Type A. Those are still really expensive, so I pretty much just stick to the SD cards. I know that if you were going to shoot 5.7K internal, you probably are going to need a very fast SD card or a very fast CF Express card. I have not tested that because the CF Express Type B card that I have not used since I tested the Z6 from Nikon, and I can't find that card because I haven't used it in like 2 or 3 years. But anyhow, dual card slots nonetheless. On the other side of the camera, we have our port doors, and our port doors will open up with a nice mic up here at top that is out of the way of everything. Mic is typically something you're going to have plugged in, and so when you're flipping your screen around and doing all that stuff, you don't want it to be in the way. I love the placement of it. I love that camera manufacturers are finally putting those up and out of the way. We do have a headphone jack here, and then down below that, we have a USB Type-C and an HDMI port, full-size HDMI port as well, which is fantastic. As I said before, we've got a record button on the front of the camera, and then of course the lens release here, and we've got two buttons over on the inside right by the grip that can be customized, used for things like depth of field, preview and stuff like that, or just any settings. You can go in and customize those as well. We have our continuous shooting modes here, and also the ability to set a shooting timer. And then on the back of the camera, we've got a variety of buttons as well. As I get my camera to focus, up top we have our manual focus, continuous, and single focus. We have focus buttons, AF on. We've got a D-pad toggle, quick menu settings, menu, and a rotating, kind of rotating dial here, and then a few additional buttons. So pretty common button layout for cameras. If you were used to shooting with a Sony, this is probably going to be pretty familiar to you. So as I have been talking about this camera and walking around it, of course we've been showing you some photos and some video clips. My overall experience with this camera, I will follow up at the end of this video. Next we're going to jump into the A7 IV. All right, so now we're recording on the GH6, and I have the A7 IV in my hand. I'm actually recording internal to the GH6 as opposed to using the Atomos because, of course, I could shoot ProRes internal on the GH6, and I want to see how well that edits. I'm sure it's going to be just fine. So let's talk about the A7 IV. The A7 IV is a full-frame camera as opposed to the Micro Four Thirds of the Lumix GH6. With this camera positioned where it's at, with this lens, I'm typically shooting to frame myself in here at around 60 to 62 millimeters. However, on the Lumix, I am at about 40 millimeters, maybe a little bit wider than that, and have the same framing. And so that's one thing to consider, is that every lens that you attach to your GH6 is going to be much more zoomed in as far as the focal length goes than what you might be used to if you're coming from something else. So the full frame camera here absolutely is great because not only are you getting the benefits of a full frame sensor, you're getting 33 megapixel stills, which is a lot bigger than what you get out of the Lumix. And in my opinion, and also in my tests, the low light performance is significantly better on the A7 IV. The A7 IV does shoot 4K 120p at 422 10-bit. Of course, the GH6 does that, but the GH6 can one-up that with the 5.7K at 60p, which it can also do at 422 10-bit. And then, of course, the ProRes internal, which is just great, being able to shoot ProRes 422 HQ internal on that Lumix. But the massive ISO range that the A7 IV has is extremely beneficial for being able to shoot in a lot of different environments. Now, one will say, yes, I could simply light and rig up the situation so that it is much more appealing, and a lot of times, you know, that's the best thing to do if you're shooting video, is light your scene appropriately, and then it doesn't really matter, your ISO performance is not really going to matter. But in a lot of instances, I don't have that flexibility, and for people who are wedding shooters or event shooters who are not going to have the time or even the ability to light and totally set up an entire scene, you're going to need a camera that is flexible, and the A7 IV is much more flexible there. The A7 IV also has phase and contrast detect autofocus, whereas the GH6 only has contrast autofocus, and the contrast autofocus just is not enough to lock on. Now, of course, in a situation like this, the camera can lock on to me relatively easy, but in lower light situations, the GH6 struggles big time, and Sony has made big strides in autofocus in low light situations through the iterations of their cameras. And so the A7 IV, to me, is a better overall camera for hybrid shooters. This is really the hybrid shooter's dream camera that want to shoot photos, that want to shoot video. The Lumix GH6 is by no means a slouch when it comes to these things, but you are going to need a lot more patience and time with that camera. It simply just does not work as fast or react as fast as the A7 IV does, and that is where the A7 IV has always been just a great camera for me, and prior versions of this camera have performed well also. And so one more thing that I'll say about the A7 IV is that, yes, it does have a flip-out screen, but it does not have a flip-out screen that also tilts. And that is something that I really do like about the GH6, is having the best of both of those worlds. I do not at all think that it is something that you should use as a decision-making factor on to buy one camera versus the other, but it is nice. I do not like the flip out screen in and of itself without having some sort of a tilt up feature, as I mentioned when I was talking about the GH6. So let's jump into my final thoughts on the cameras. All right, so my final thoughts on both of these cameras. While I really like the GH6 and the image that comes out of the GH6 is really nice, and in the correct situation where you have good lighting and everything is good, the GH6 is a fantastic camera and very easy to use. A lot of times I found myself struggling with autofocus on this camera. Continuous autofocus and even single autofocus in photo mode is just not that great. It is super slow in comparison to the Sony a7 IV. Now, most people are going to say, well, I don't get the GH6 to shoot autofocus. Well, I find myself in most situations needing autofocus a majority of the time. I am not always shooting manual, even when I am shooting with my a7 IV rig here, which is an a7 IV, and it does have a manual cine lens on it. Of course, this is when I would shoot manual, but I am not all the time shooting with a manual lens. It is tricky and challenging to shoot with a manual lens, and you do need a camera, I believe, that has good autofocus that you can rely on. When you're out on a job, when you are doing work that you're getting paid for, you can't ask somebody 100 times to redo something, and a lot of times you're not going to get the same emotion out of the subject if you ask them to do something again because your camera failed to achieve focus, or you were manually focusing and you slipped up and weren't able to pull focus correctly. Most of the time we're shooting and we need the benefits of autofocus, and because autofocus is so good these days, I rely on it in a lot of situations, especially with my secondary cameras. If I have other people filming with me, I'm usually have them in autofocus because I trust the autofocus a little bit more than trying to have people who don't have a lot of experience with manual focus trying to manual focus. And so the GH6, while a fantastic camera, just the autofocus is nothing that I could rely on in really any scenario. It fails to tack onto people, it fails to stay on people, and I'm always chasing it around by hitting the shutter button or maybe even switching into manual focus and overwriting and manual focusing because I'm more accurate than this camera is on its own. Now, if I needed high frame rates at 5.7K, obviously this is going to be the camera that I'm going to go for. That is a ton of resolution, and 60p is fantastic for that. If there's a use case for that, then I might find myself leaning towards a camera like this for that specific situation. However, I don't find myself in a situation like that very often. So when it comes to cameras, for me, it's reliability and what I can trust when I am out on a job, because I am there to be a professional. I'm there to capture what my client needs without making them do things 100 times. And I just don't feel like the GH6 is that camera for those environments. And you know, most will say, well, you know, you got to have the appropriate team there in order to film and use cameras like this and get the most out of these cameras. I totally agree. On bigger budget jobs where you have people to pull focus for you and you have a couple of camera operators and you have enough of a team to be able to manage all of those things, then go with the best camera that produces the best image and gives you the features that you need. But for me, being someone who's mostly shooting either by himself or with a skeleton crew, I have to have cameras that I can rely on, and the Sony a7 IV is just that camera. So with that said, I invite your questions and comments down in the comment section below, because I enjoy having conversations about this stuff. This is my opinion, and I know you probably have one too, so let's talk about it down in the comment section, and if you have any questions, leave them there as well. But that's going to do it for today's video. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. It was a longer video. I appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you back in another one soon. Take care.